Hello everyone, this is your history teacher here, and today I'm going to start the very first chapter of Grade 8 NCERT, Our Past, Part 3rd, that is How, When and Where. Students, in this chapter, we will discuss that why we study history and why it is so important to remember the dates and happenings of past of the different part of the world. So let's start. But before moving on towards the chapter, we will see that what we are going to discuss in this chapter means to say, first of all, we will discuss your session plan of this chapter. So let's start. Students, as you can see here, this is the session plan of your chapter number 1. And in your chapter number 1, we are going to discuss all these topics here. First of all, we will learn and discuss how important are dates, means to say that what is the importance of dates in history. Secondly, we will learn and discuss why we associate dates with history. Next, we will learn that how do we periodize them. Then we will discuss and learn that what is colonial or what is the meaning of this word. Then we will learn and discuss that how do we know about our past. Then lastly, we will learn and discuss that what official records do not tell and what they tell. So let's start. Students, have you ever thought why the dates are so important? Remembering dates is not an easy job. Moreover, it is not even an interesting task for many of us, but have you ever thought why we need to remember dates or why we should study history? Well, anything which we see happening in our surrounding must have begun on some day. For example, we drink tea or coffee, but how did it become part of our dietary habit and when it first came into use by man? Not only this, we all must have traveled by train. So when did trains start in India? Such questions take us back to the notion of dates and times, but time is not always precise. Sometimes we even don't know about the exact date or time of that particular happening. Students, now there is a question that why we can't fix a particular date. Student, we can't fix a particular date because many of the things happen over a stretch of time. We know that Britishers came to India around 1608 and then they started ruling India from 1757. But do we know the exact date of the year 1757 on which they started ruling? Similarly, if we move back to the example of tea, do we know the exact date on which Indians started drinking tea? That is why it is not possible to fix date for each and every event. Students, now there is a question that why we associate dates with history? Students, it is because in early times, the court historians used to record only the crucial events of a king's life, such as his coronation, marriage, and the battles fought by him. So now we know why dates are important. Now let's move on towards the next slide. Student, a date doesn't become important if something big happened on that day in the past, but it gains its significance on the basis of how much keen we are to study the events which happened during a particular time. And if our focus changes, the importance of the dates also changes. Let's take an example. The British historians begin their history with the first Governor General of Bengal, who was Warren Hastings, and it continues up to the last Viceroy of India, Lord Mountbatten. Their history mainly focuses on the activities, policies, and the lifestyle of these men. It doesn't talk about anything else. Here, what I want to say is that some other events were also happening at that time in India within the society, but nothing was put on record for them. So the chronology means sequence. So the chronology of lives of these British officers marks a different chapter of British history. So can we write history covering the events which were related to Indian society within the format of British Governor Generals? Yes, we can. And for this, we have to write it in a sequence so that it not only sounds like a story but also the one with sense. In the process of writing the whole story with a shift in the subject, we would be in a need of some new set of dates, making the old dates less significant, and thus a new set of dates will become important. So for that, we have to periodize those events. Now the question is that how do we periodize these events? Students, in 1817, there was a Scottish economist and political philosopher named James Mill. As you can see here in this slide, he was the man named James Mill. He wrote a 3 volumes named book, that is a history of British India. And in this book, he periodized Indian history of that time in his book. And in this book, he periodized the Indian history of that time. And the main contents of his books are, and in his book, he divided Indian history into 3 categories, namely Hindu, Muslim, British, on the basis of the rulers of different period. According to this man, James Mill, all Asian societies were at a lower level than the European civilization. According to him, Hindu and Muslim rulers had ruled India and they were huge intolerance against the religion of each other. Some social evils were also present, such as caste system, superstitious beliefs, etc. As you can see here, the Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra. That time, the Indian society was divided into different groups on the basis of the caste. According to him, it was necessary to introduce European education and manners to them for their upliftment, because James Mill thought that the Indian society was so savage that James Mill thought it was important to introduce European education and manners. Students, do you think that such an idea can be accepted? First of all, we cannot categorize Indian history as totally a Hindu history or Muslim history, as rulers from both the religions had ruled within the same period of time. Moreover, many other faiths also existed in India simultaneously with Hindu and Muslim religion, and they all were practicing their faiths freely. Moving away from the British classification, the historians have divided Indian history into ancient, medieval, and modern. But this categorization also has some problems. Generally, when we talk about the modern period, it denotes the growth of the science and technology, and also the freedom, liberty, and equality to the citizen of that society. But during the rule of Britishers, there was no such rights given to the Indian citizens. Rather, they were forced by the Britishers for one thing or another. Moreover, Britishers took away all the resources and wealth away from India, and thus many of the historians treat it as a colonial period. Students, now there is a question that what is colonial, or what is the meaning of this word? Students, here in this book, you will learn how Britishers established their rule in India and took control over all the territories, revenue, and other resources of our country. Students, Britishers forced Indians to sell their goods at low prices and made them produce the crops they needed. They forced the Indian to produce the crops that they needed. The Britishers also brought changes in our culture, customs, economy, and taste. And students, all these things refer to colonization of India. So now the question arises that how we know about all the happenings and their time period. Now let's get to know this, that how we know about all the happenings and their time period in the next slide. So let's move on to the next slide. Students, historians rely on different sources for writing history, and in this section we will discuss all those sources that they depend on for the history. Number one is administration records. Students, one of the important sources is the record of the British administration. Students, the Britishers were of a view that each and every policy and agreement should be recorded so that it could be studied and debated if needed. And this led to an administrative culture of writing memos, reports, etc. And during that time, record rooms were maintained within the office of Tehsildars, Commissioner's Office, and law courts. Specialized institutions like archives and museums were also made in order to preserve the important records of that time. Students, you were amazed to know that Britishers also appointed some special persons in order to copy the important documents, and those persons that times known as calligraphists. The next source on which the historians rely upon is surveys. Students, under the colonial administration, surveys became very important during the time of Britishers. They wanted to know more about India in order to administer it or control it properly. So they conducted detailed survey for many reasons, like to map out India, to know the soil quality, to check the suitability for different crops, to know about the flora and fauna of India, to know the local histories, etc. And that's why these surveys became very important under colonial administration. Some of the surveys that were conducted during that times were botanical survey, archaeological survey, forest survey, geological survey. So what we can say is that we can get a lot of information from the surveys conducted by the Britishers that time. But were these sufficient to serve as a source to know history of India? Let's see. Now moving on towards the next slide. Students, there isn't any doubt that we get a good amount of information from these surveys that we discussed in the earlier slide, but we should know that these surveys were recorded according to the point of view of the officers. In order to know what other people of the country felt and the reason behind their actions, we need to look for the other sources such as the diaries of the peoples, autobiographies, account of pilgrims and the travelers that visited during that time in India, and the popular booklets, newspapers, idea of leaders, poets, and social reformers. All these serve as a good source to write the history. Now, students, your chapter is finished here, and that's all about your chapter. Now, I will be come back very soon with a new chapter. Till then, stay home, stay safe.